Hello, Oscillator Sync here. I've just released a brand new EP. It's called Pale and Stasis, and it's available on my Bandcamp page. You can find links to it in the description of this video. And making this EP was a particularly enjoyable experience for a bunch of different reasons. So, with your permission, I'd like to talk about it a little bit, talk about the process, the gear, because we know we like that discussion, and also talk a little bit about what I learned from this particular release. There's almost nothing in this world that I find quite so paralysing as a completely blank canvas and total freedom. So whenever I take on one of these projects, the first thing I try and do is establish, rule is probably a bit too dogmatic, but certainly a guideline or a framework for what this particular release, particular project is going to be about. So the last one that I released at the end of 2023, that was pretty straightforward. The framework there was that I was going to do the entire thing on the Electron syntax, and then on top of that I kind of added the rule that it was going to be sort of performed live, single pattern, and that was how that release came together. For this release, I didn't have anything quite as specific as that in mind. Instead, I had these sort of words, primitive, primordial, especially in terms of their relationship to the actual instruments. And when I say primitive, I only really mean it in a positive way. A bunch of instruments that I found especially inspiring as of late have sort of had this vibe about them where there's a very direct path between you and the sounds that get created. It's unfiltered, it's raw, if we're going to use that word. And that was kind of what I wanted to embrace on this project. And that sort of guided both what instruments I used and other gear, and also the approach compositionally, which is dictated both by those instruments but also by that vibe as well. Let's zip back to a warmer studio and talk about what stuff I actually used to make these sounds. It was kind of tricky to work out what order to talk about the gear that I use, because so much of it kind of interacts with other parts of the setup in a lot of cases. But let's start with probably the least surprising part, which is that the Lyra-8 was used a whole lot. Obviously, if you've followed my channel at all, you know that I love this instrument dearly, and now that I've had it for about 2 years, I think probably I'll do a video about it separately and talk about some of the ways that I enjoy using it. But one thing that I lent into a lot on this particular EP was I was using the total feedback mode a whole lot, and on the Lyra you have this modulation that you can set per sort of voice cluster, and that can be like the LFO, or it can be sort of intermodulation between the different voices, or this total feedback, and basically that modulates each voice by the output of the entire instrument, which makes it extremely interactive. It's kind of the most organismic that it gets. So you would go from something like this, if we turn this on, you can hear how the voice is kind of almost like fight for space a little bit more, and then you turn on the self mode on the delay as well for even more of that kind of vibe. So I was using that a whole lot. I used it in lots of different ways. Sometimes I had the LFO sort of modulating voices to do kind of sequences and stuff. Yeah, I used it on most tracks, although it wasn't always recorded directly on all the tracks, which is something that we'll get to. So yeah, this was used a lot. It's probably not the sort of MVP of the entire EP though, because the one thing that was used on pretty much every single sound source that's recorded across the whole EP is this, the Luma mix from LEP. It's a mixer. It's a 4-channel mixer with a send and return and a filter at the end, which can be low pass, band pass, or high pass. If you're interested in learning a bit more about it, I did a video on it and some of its friends from the same series. I'll put a link in the description and there'll be a thing that appears up there. I kind of used it for 2 reasons. First is that it has this kind of dirty sound character, sort of dusty, but it also overdrives. In a really exciting way. I think we're overdriving the filter, strictly speaking, when you do that. And I use that a whole lot to get characters in sound. It gets even more exciting when you have multiple inputs going through it, so things sort of dance in the distortion. And the other thing is the filter, because a lot of the sound sources, the instruments that I used, either had like horrible amounts of low end that was kind of unusable, or that I wanted to thin out in general for the character of the track, or a whole lot of sort of fizz and grit or rustle that I wanted to sort of bring out or take out of the sound. I could filter things and sort of precondition things so that they worked better in the context of what I was trying to do at any particular time. And actually there's a third reason why I use it a lot, and that is that it's got a send on it, which allowed me to do a trick that I used also a whole lot on the EP. Because if there was a sonic characteristic for this EP, it's probably coming from this, the Simon the Magpie wet reverb. It's a spring reverb pedal, but implemented in the most raw, primitive, and aggressive way possible. And I kind of decided really early on in the process, as part of the ethos of the EP, the idea of primitive, raw, there was going to be no big, expansive, ambient digital reverbs allowed. So this was the obvious choice. And I used it on a lot of sound sources, almost everything really. So here I've got the Lyra going into the Luma mix, and you're hearing it through the filter, but then the send, which is pre-filter, is coming out to the wet, and I'm taking that as a separate input on my interface. So I'm not bringing it back into the mixer, I'm taking it separately. So and you've got a pre and post boost on the wet, so you can overdrive the spring, which makes it much more resonant. And then you've got this capacitor control here, which changes the pre-capacitor, which changes the resonance of things, allows more bass in. Changes how it overdrives, almost becomes its own sort of thing. And then you can also boost the output, which sort of introduces distortion. On the actual reverb signal. And yeah, I use this on most sound sources. What I did, however, is generally speaking, one sound source would be panned one way, and then this would pan to the other side to sort of spatialize things, which I'll now do in post. So it sounds like this. And you can have it sort of set clean as well. You don't have to be blasting the hell out of it if you don't want to. But even then, it's still quite resonant and characterful. Yeah, so this is on like everything, pretty much. So yeah, it really sort of defines the sonic characteristics of the recording. The only other effect that's used on the entire EP is this, the Hate Echo from Circuit Benders Co.uk. Strictly speaking, it's a digital delay pedal based on a PT2395, I think it is, chip, so similar to the 2399 chips that a lot of delay devices are built on these days, sort of that karaoke chip. But it's digital in the most primitive way possible, and like by default, that's kind of the maximum delay time. But what's great about this is that it is circuit bent, which allows us to reclock the clock speed of the delay chip. We can make it run faster and get slightly more fidelity out of it, if that's what you want. But we can also make it go much slower, which introduces a lot of digital fluff and texture, and gives us a much longer delay time. And we can go much slower if we want, and get much more of this kind of crackle and texture. You can see that the delay time gets much longer as well. And you've got this constant crackle, which is where having something like the Luma mix is really useful, because we can start to take some of that out. Or even try and emphasize it with resonance and almost get it to ping. And one thing I used it for on some tracks was to actually, using this hold control here, we can lock the feedback exactly at 1:1, and you've got a loop now. And that will just go on forever. But we can also still affect the clock speed, so we could repitch it, which I certainly did on some of the songs. We'll go up as well. And that crackle saw is kind of intrinsic to how it was recorded, so it kind of stays with it. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and this kind of fizz and crackle and fuzz around the delay sound is all over the EP, in the same way that the wet and its tonality of the spring define the overall sonics of the recording, as so did the Hate Echo and its kind of distinctive crackle.
Yeah. Lovely stuff.
When making drone-centric ambient music, one of the things that I think it's good to kind of focus on is this idea of texture. When you've got one note playing out for a very, very long time, as the form kind of dictates, it's important for that single sound within it to have internal movement, to have texture. And then you can start to play off the different sounds and how they interact with each other. But one thing that really struck me with using a lot of the instruments and other bits of equipment that I did for this release is that the less there is electronically in a device, the more texture seems to be inherent to it. Quite rightly, when people are making more conventional devices, there's a lot of effort, I think, spent dialing out inconsistencies, making sure things operate as they should. But with some of these instruments, when there's such a direct path between the electrons whizzing around the circuitry and the sound that we hear, that lack of filter, that lack of refinement is what makes them so appealing, I think, in this context.
So we've already established that I've disallowed the use of big ambient digital reverbs. They do not fit into the vibe of this EP. And by disallowing their use, I started to have to confront the question, why do I like them and what are they for, really? Because they're not really about spatialization when they are that massive and ambient. Really, they're just there to create a wash of sound for the other sounds to live within. So as I started to think about what I could use instead to replace that musical requirement, I started playing with sort of Foley recordings and field recordings to create that sort of space for the sounds to live in. And to play those back, I ended up using these two devices here. We have the Bastel Micro Granny and this sort of modified circuit bent speed control dictaphone Walkman type thing. And yes, these instruments they use to actually play the stuff back. So, of course, I used the wet to widen things too. And this is where the Luma mix came in really useful, because the Micro Granny has a load of hiss. It's unavoidable, so we could band pass things. To get things a little clearer and cleaner. And then at the other side of that, we have this dictaphone here. This one, if I just open up the filter again so we can hear it. Has just a huge amount of rumble and hum in them. So again, we can make use of maybe the bandpass filter. To start to clear that sort of stuff out. And pretty much every single song on the EP has some field recording that runs throughout the whole thing, which creates that bed that I don't have access to because I don't have my big ambient reverb. So yeah, these are my samplers for this EP. The micro granny also played another role on the recording, which was that of kind of a looper, playback, recontextualizer. So the second track on the EP in particular leans really heavy into this, where I recorded a performance on the Lyra and then loaded it into the micro granny and then used the micro granny to recontextualize that performance, changing the grain size and shift. To change how that performance was played back. Now, intrinsic to the micro granny, especially for these sort of held notes, there's this click that happens. So what I did, rather than try and totally avoid it, was start to think about how I could make a sort of feature of it by allowing it to sort of ping into the filter a little bit and make it a rhythmic element instead. So there are a couple of tracks on the EP where, although I'm using other instruments, they're being played back on the micro granny rather than on themselves. There is a singular moment on the whole EP where you hear something approaching a conventional beat, and what you're hearing is the lap multicassette. Actually, what you're hearing is the dictaphone playing back a loop of the multicassette, but this is what's generating the sound in the first place. I need to do a whole video about this thing because I love it so much. It is an algorithmic drum machine, but it's the absolutely most primitive way of implementing the drum machine element and also the algorithm element. So I won't dive into it too much today because I want to do a video on it, but yeah, this is what you're hearing on the EPI, and I love it. Yeah, so we'll talk about this on another day. But it's just fantastic. It sounds so good, it's so much fun. Yeah. So this is what you're hearing when you hear that beat. Much of the EP is about building up textures using drones. So there's kind of an orchestra of other instruments that were used. The Lyra-8 was used a lot. Probably the second most used instrument would have been the Luminoise V4 here, which is a really lovely, characterful drone synth, which has quite a lot of internal drive, where you can get quite a lot movement happening between the different voices. And it's light controlled, so you can create pitch glides across all of the voices like that. You do that quite a bit on the EP. We have the SN, the Tin from Decade Bridge, which is a really lo-fi FM voice. Lots of lovely fluff that sort of sits around it. One of the tracks is pretty much all focused on the SN. Lots of nice sort of movements within itself, depending on how you have the modulator set. We've got the Ovum, which is like just oscillators, pure just oscillators, very raw, very sort of pure as well. And you've got sliders for each of them, of course. Generally speaking, when I used the Ovum, I also used the Accomplished Badger from Frederick Effects as a preamp. This is the best preamp overdrive pedal for electronic instruments. It just is. It just is. So that was used mostly with the Ovum, possibly with some other things as well, but certainly whenever I used the Ovum, generally speaking, it went through the Accomplished Badger, just so it made the individual oscillators kind of interact more within the saturation. And then we also have the Rumble of Ancient Times here, which is an extremely sort of lo-fi digital drone voice, which can also be sequenced. On track 5, the quite long track, there's quite a lot of rote sort of being sequenced to create like tiny little sub melodies. And of course we can put it through the wet as well. And we can kind of overdrive and get some crunch. So a lot of this.
Creatively speaking, 2024 in general wasn't a super good year for me. If you follow the channel, you probably noticed that there weren't a whole lot of videos put out last year. And that was in part because my mental health wasn't kind of at its best. Like, I'm fine, but like I know myself well enough to spot when I'm kind of at a low ebb. But I'm also male and British and a geriatric millennial, so of course I won't ask for help or do anything about it. Anyway, I kind of got into this sort of bad loop, feedback loop, ironically, or appropriately, I guess, where I couldn't motivate myself to make videos because I kind of wanted to make music, but then I wouldn't allow myself to make music because it felt like a reward that I hadn't earned because I wasn't putting out enough videos. And that just kind of went round and round and round to the point where I wasn't putting out videos or music, and I would just spend evenings, sat playing Civilization 6 rather than doing anything creative, getting to the end of the evening and hating myself for not actually doing either of the things that I could have spent the evening doing. Anyway, I had some time off over Christmas at the end of a fairly intensive sound design commission. I kind of banned myself from making videos. So it was off the table. I wasn't allowed to do it at all. And as soon as I sort of made that agreement with myself, this EP just came pouring out of me. I wasn't even sure if I was going to turn it into anything to begin with, but when I removed that pressure and the associated guilt with it, it became really, really easy and really, really enjoyable to do it. So I think the lesson I'm going to try and take away from this particular project is that I need to make it easy for myself, to give myself permission and space to be creative, to make music. Because when I finished this project, I felt so much better. My mood was lifted, and that's kind of persisted into this new year. I think as a musician, and I mean that not as in a professional musician, but just someone who makes music, which I presume most of the people watching this video are, I think making music for the sake of making music, noodling, without any pressure, without any self-judgment or guilt piled on it, is just pure self-care. And I think self-care, especially these days, is something that we should try and prioritise at all costs, but no pressure to do it. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you're watching this video and you feel like you need permission to make music today, consider this permission granted. Go make some music, because it'll probably make you feel better, or at least it did for me anyway. So thanks for watching, folks. Till next time, take care. Bye bye.